saying that this is an unlawful assembly, you are to disperse. Your orders to disperse, go home, or go to your church.
Just goes to show you what happens when you take the nigger out of the jungle, but you can't take the jungle out of the nigger.
I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
As long as there is one living white man in the United States, the Supreme Court is not the law of the land.
That I feel that their standards is not up to the white standard.
The United States is a country that struggled with race relations throughout its history and still does today.
Racial conflict in America is actually more about perception than anything else. It stems from the two highly controversial concepts that are rarely talked about. It's what gave birth to racism. We're talking about the notions of superiority and inferiority, and where these notions originated.
Jesus was a white man too.
We're going to protect Christianity, and I can say that.
And there's a white hand on my chest. And I actually think I'm dead. I'm like, God? Because like I see a white hand on my chest. And like,
Jesus, he had a rough but kind face, sea blue eyes.
Racism always seems to be a hot topic. It often dominates the headlines and is on the minds of many Americans. Century after century, decade after decade, year after year, there never seems to be a shortage of racial conflicts. One has to be honest, though. We have come a long way. A lot of the rough edges of racism have been made smoother, and things are not as blatant or overt as before. We've made progress in addressing racial issues and abandoning offensive words that were once commonplace in our language. Blacks and whites have stood side by side in defending racial injustice, but there is still much racial disparity in this country.
Well, and I've represented criminal defendants for 22 years, and I see it firsthand, how white defendants are treated differently than how African-American defendants are treated.
No one wants to discuss the possibility that concepts of superiority and inferiority still exists and are also perpetually implied. We mainly associate ideas of one group believing to be superior to other groups with open white supremacists.
Would you consider yourself a white supremacist?
I do consider myself a white supremacist, sure. If white people are superior.
We live in a white supremacist culture. And now that is a shocking thing to say from, again, a traditional framework, right? I was raised to think of a white supremacist as somebody who would march in Charlottesville carrying tiki torches.
But the practice and implementation of white supremacy is insidious, and more often than not, flies under the radar of our awareness. Racism is deceptive and subtle, and is much more pervasive than one can imagine. There's very little understanding why one group would discriminate or desire to live separately from other groups. Some say it's only natural to want to be around people who look like themselves and share similar interests. But racism goes beyond mere looks.
Mainstream culture uses prejudice and racism interchangeably. right? So prejudice is prejudgment. All human beings have prejudices about other social groups of human beings as defined in a given culture. It's just kind of a human dynamic to have prejudgments.
You can be prejudiced all day for any number of reasons, but when you begin to use that prejudice in ways that really delimit and control another group of people based on physical characteristics, particularly when we're talking about color, then we're talking about racism.
Racism is a ranking system, an invention to justify the brutal treatment of other human beings. It started from a belief that a God created some to rule and others to serve. It was the mindset upon which America was built. This mindset didn't happen overnight. It's the result of a series of court cases, particularly in 17th and 18th century Virginia. Virginia is where racism was perfected and institutionalized. If we don't understand early Virginia, it'll be difficult to fully understand racism in America. We tend to think of history, especially things that happened hundreds of years ago, as something that's over and gone and is no longer relevant. But history is like an old tree whose roots run deeply and continue to bear fruit. What we did in America yesterday gave birth to what we are experiencing today. America is inextricably tethered to its past. Virginia had all the superstars, such as George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and Patrick Henry. They were the dream team in the sport of politics. Virginia is called the mother of presidents. 7 of the first 12 presidents were born in Virginia, and 10 of the first 12 presidents owned slaves. Virginia is also the birthplace of American slavery. America's status on race relations is largely due to where Virginia has led it. Virginia led the rest of the colonies in how enslaved Africans were to be treated and handled, and what rights, if any, they may have had. Case by case, from John Punch to John Phillip to Robert Sweat and many others, America imposed inferior positions upon blacks from a legal standpoint by writing into law the principles of white superiority. Each case was like a stair-step that divided whites from everyone else and pushed them higher and higher up the social totem pole. One of the first cases on record involving a black man in Virginia courtrooms involves the case of John Phillip, who testified against a white man who allegedly seized a ship and held people hostage. Mr. Phillips's testimony was upheld only because he had been christened in England prior to its presence in Virginia. The adherence to the Christian faith was a bonus for many enslaved blacks. Blacks who were demonstrative in their expressions of Christianity were more likely to be spared a beating and had certain privileges than those who rejected their master's religion altogether.
Participating in religious activities, religious events, at least on the surface, convinced some whites that these were Africans who were content with their plight and would not cause trouble. Another reason, a more compelling reason, was that some Africans looked at the relationship between whites and Christianity, for example, and saw that it produced power, and that if this religion could provide whites with power, it was a tradition that might work for their benefit, a rather pragmatic understanding of what religion might entail.
In 1640, the Virginia courts sent a clear message of how blacks were, in addition to being beneath the white race, were beneath all of humanity and were considered no greater than the wild beasts of burden. American slavery was an economic endeavor, and racism was invented to justify it.
Why were Africans chosen? What happened there? And that's where you go into the whole theology of who is Christian and who is pagan. And the notion that Africans could be enslaved because Africans were not human, because Africans were not believers in Christ, that Africans were, in a sense, heathens, that notion was a driving force in the enslavement of African people.
You start with the exploitation of people's resources, right? A group of people have something you want, and you have the means to get that, and so you get it, and then you make up a story that rationalizes your behavior, right? So we exploited the labor and bodies of Africans, enslaved, kidnapped Africans, in a context that professed that all people were equal, and that had to be reconciled. And so we made up this story that Africans were inherently less human, and therefore it was justified.
Robert Sweat was a white Virginian who impregnated a black woman who was owned by Lieutenant Shepard, another white man, who felt that the black woman being his property was devalued by becoming pregnant. Robert Sweat was accused of the crime of defiling and shaming his body by sleeping with something that was considered less than human. Sweat was punished by having to show remorse and forgiveness in public at his church, but the black woman of whom he impregnated was beaten and whipped. Later, in 1662, the Virginia legislature passed a law that would address racial purity with regards to sex and inferiority. Having any drop of black blood was considered to be legally inferior.
For black people, one drop of black blood and you're out. For indigenous peoples, 46% indigenous blood or you're out. It's made up, it's irrational, it doesn't align because that's not its purpose. Its purpose is to justify white supremacy, and that's what it does.
In another case regarding indentured servants, 3 runaways, 2 whites and 1 black, named John Punch, were captured and returned to face trial in Virginia. All the men received 30 lashes. However, the white men were sentenced to serve an additional 4 years in the field, but John Punch was sentenced to a lifetime of servitude on the plantation. These were the kinds of court cases, year by year, in which the trend of black devaluation was becoming the norm, and where even poor whites were beginning to see themselves as privileged.
Around 1640s, 1660s in Virginia and Massachusetts, they decided that the only people who could be, the whites decided, only people who could be held in bondage in perpetuity were Africans because they didn't believe in Jesus. So then, of course, you know, even after there were black people who believed in Jesus, they were still enslaved. It didn't matter.
In addition to the many court cases that filled whites with a sense of racial esteem and guaranteed them favor under the law, many white settlers felt they were above blacks because of the accepted precepts of the time. Not only was there an implicit understanding amongst the settlers that blacks were inferior, but black inferiority was explicitly legitimized. Precepts are general rules that taught the colonies what to believe about blacks. They regulated their thoughts and behavior and shaped their perceptions. One of the most fundamental precepts was that a God created and ordained whites to be superior over the inferior blacks, who were naturally crafted by this God to be the servants of whites and the flawed footstools of society.
You know, if you're seen as the righteous tribe, and that's really what it is, if you're seen as the righteous tribe, then all other tribes are unrighteous. And that influences your behavior towards those other people. And it's simply a tribal component. I can identify people that look like me. They probably are my tribe. People that don't look like me probably are not of my tribe. And then if I have a religion that says people that are not of my tribe and of a different color are also sinful or in some way tainted, that leads to how I will treat those people.
Keep in mind that they were worshiping a God who, according to the scriptures, the Hebrew Bible, for example, was not opposed to the shedding of blood. And so they understood their taming of folks and their taming of the land as simply what humans needed to do in order to live out God's will.
Racism has to do with a measurement of worth and value, and our Bibles and dictionaries are largely responsible for that.
So is the Bible a racist document? I think it's the very foundation of it is one race has the right to dominate another race based upon a God-given set of beliefs and ideas.
I wouldn't say that the Bible is a racist document. The term race and the category of racism are so burdened with modern understandings, modern cultural context, that I don't think it's an appropriate way to understand this text. But I would say that the Bible understands difference as a problem to solve, that it understands difference as something that has to be tackled and tamed.
Between 1619 and 1662, there were already established presumptions of the precept of black inferiority. Before the English came to America, they had ideas regarding the color of black in general. The Oxford English Dictionary, prior to the 16th century, defined the color black as deeply stained with dirt, soiled, foul, having a deadly purpose, malignant, baneful, disastrous, sinister, atrocious, horrible, and wicked. The English had a tradition of using the color black to symbolize everything they deemed as ugly, deadly, and evil, and the color white to symbolize purity, virginity, innocence, goodness, heaven, safety, understanding, cleanliness, sincerity, perfection, and light.
There is absolutely no biological basis for race. That's why we call it a social construct. It's not grounded in biology, it's grounded in culture, it's grounded in social need and social narrative.
It is a concept that was based fundamentally on the idea of ranking people by virtue of physical characteristics as to whether or not they were inferior or superior.
One of the synonyms used to describe white is light, and one of the synonyms for the color black is darkness. And it's interesting to see how it's used in the Bible. And God saw the light, that it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness, which is somewhat ironic, this verse of dividing light, white, from darkness, black.
Well, certainly I believe in segregation because God teaches it. I think it's God's plan that the races be segregated. We find a lot of scripture on it.
From a scientific standpoint, this so-called division of day and night has no basis. It's simply a matter of the tilting and rotation of the earth. The Bible further states that God made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night. This is also a cosmological blunder. This so-called lesser light is merely the moon reflecting the sun's light. This may have been interpreted as a kind of coded language that suited various political and economic agendas during the time of American enslavement.
As we come over from England and colonize this North American continent, we are doing God's work. And that colonization mentality, that white supremacist mentality, that manifest destiny mentality, all comes directly from the religion that they brought over with them.
White supremacy have been justified based upon transhistorical claims. That is to say, we were made superior by God, and God wants us as a superior race to have all of this stuff.
Racism is a complex thing and part of a long process. The root of racism lies in the presumptions of the existence of a singular, masculine, all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfect being to whom we must be obedient and submissive to his will. From there, it travels to beliefs, which gives rise to belief systems, leading to various books, denominations, practices, and rituals. From there, it stumbles into a contradiction, one that believes that something perfect could create people that are imperfect. This process continues until precepts of superiority and inferiority emerge. And once this occurs, these precepts work their way into the legal system. The legal system then enforces inferior positions upon people, and ultimately, racism becomes an institution and a way of life. This is the gestation period that gives birth to racism.
Let's put it this way. I think that the origins of it are in the notions of my God is greater than your God.
From 1662 until around 1691, the Virginia legislature passed various laws that established the colonial commandments regarding black inferiority. These general rules gave whites advantages and privileges that allowed them to have a great head start in terms of acquiring wealth and passing on that wealth.
We make a mistake if we assume that white privilege and economic well-being are the same. When we talk about white privilege, we are not simply talking about class status. That white privilege entails a more expansive sense of entitlement, the understanding that what is present for my benefit.
Colonial lawmakers and businessmen were largely responsible for these laws that changed the way people perceived others who were different than they were, and essentially justified discrimination and inequality. The words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal," is interesting. Why would it be necessary to state something that was declared as self-evident, unless there were already presumptions that all men were not created equally?
He meant white men. He meant not just white men. He meant white men with property. He didn't have any other kind of human being in mind.
I think he meant all white men. I think the framework of patriarchy, you can't separate patriarchy, Christianity, and white supremacy. I don't know that you can separate those out. And so that framework is so internalized that you don't even know you have it, right? It's like a fish in water.
Jefferson did not believe that African people were equal to whites, even though he slept with a young 14-year-old black woman. He didn't believe, African woman, he didn't believe that they were equal to white people. The Virginia experience, it has been repeated over and over again in the Western world. Because after all, you remember, It was von Humboldt and the people in the German universities that came up with the notion of hierarchy of races.
There were scientific rock stars in the 19th century, turn of the 20th century, who wanted to argue that there was a biological basis for assuming that so-called racial minorities were inferior. But rock stars like Louis Agassiz went further and argued that even the aesthetics of a black body, the look of a black body, spoke to inferiority.
All men are created equal may have been inserted into the Declaration of Independence in order to shine a moral light on respected statesmen such as Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, who contradictorily own human beings. Thomas Jefferson, widely regarded as the father of the nation and considered the most important figure in American history, owned approximately 175 slaves at the time he wrote the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson, cited as being a cruel owner, was a frequent buyer and seller of slaves and encouraged his friends and neighbors to do the same. The impact of his words are immeasurable.
The differences amongst the Negro are fixed in nature. No man will labor for himself who can make another labor for him. A slave's darker skin pigment makes them less transparent. Their color is an immovable veil of black which covers all the emotions. Their unfortunate difference of color make them less beautiful than whites. The appearance of whites, our features and our hair make us more sexually appealing. The Negro people are sexually attracted to white people as uniformly as is the preference of the orangutan for the black women over those of his own species. Free blacks are pests in society who are as incapable as children of taking care of themselves. Blacks are inferior to the whites in the endowments of body and mind. Their griefs are transient, and their love lacks a tender, delicate mixture of sentiment and sensation. I have never seen an elementary trait of painting or sculpture or poetry among blacks. Their ability to reason is much inferior to whites, and their imaginations are dull, tasteless, and anomalous. Blackness comes from the color of the blood.
Centuries later, the words, "all men are created equal," played out more in theory than it did in practice. Because if lawmakers really believed that all human beings were so-called created equally and had equal value, there wouldn't have been a segregated system such as Jim Crow, or even the necessity of a movement such as Black Lives Matter. Racism is not always about what the eyes see, but it also has to do with what the mind believes. We are taught how and what to think about others. It was the so-called founding fathers that planted the seed of racial injustice in America and cultivated the idea that one group can be so radically different than another that they can essentially be classified as animals, somewhere between apes and humans.
This is not a question of social equality, but a question of recognizing a fundamental, eternal, inescapable difference.
Warren G. Harding, 29th President of the United States.
Scientists who were thinking of how do you make yourself superior to everybody else, and so they began, I believe, with cranial studies. They tried to base intelligence on the size of people's skulls. Of course, that didn't pan out, and so they looked for a number of different ways, but they were all the while inventing this notion of race and of difference, always projecting themselves as Europeans as being the superior of every other quote-unquote race.
White supremacy is the notion that those of European descent are smarter, are better, and should be in charge of how the world functions. It's the argument that simply because they are of European descent, they are of a superior category of human, and as a consequence, everything ought to work to their advantage, everything ought to benefit them, everything should point to their well-being.
We can produce amendment after amendment. We can desegregate schools and society. We can march until we wear out the soles of our heels. We can protest acts of injustice decade after decade, but there will still be, as W.E.B. Du Bois stated, the problem of the color line. The reason is because racial injustice and attitudes about particular groups are embedded into the psyche of people. You cannot legislate how one group feels about another group.
You cannot legislate in a way that will make people like each other, but what you can do is legislate in such a way as to limit the kind of harm dislike can do to populations.
There are societies where you have laws and constitutions that say that there are certain things you cannot do. It doesn't mean you cannot think them, but you can't do them.
The notion of white supremacy was a precept that over time bled into the legal system, so it cannot be eradicated exclusively through legal processes. White supremacy must first be eradicated from the mind. Concepts of superiority and inferiority amongst human beings were heavily influenced by the Bible.
The Bible is a pillar of white supremacy. Whether it naturally is a pillar or was meant to be a pillar, but that it has functioned as a pillar of white supremacy, I think is undeniable.
There are passages out of the Bible that people use from time to time. Slaves, obey your masters, for example, or as people have often said, there's a chapter, Romans 13, that is used to try to get people to obey anything the state or the government says or does.
The Bible, written entirely by men, teaches us that there can be favored groups, that there can be people who are chosen and are special in their Creator's eyes, and that those not in line with certain beliefs can and should be punished or even put to death.
The Bible legitimizes violence. The biblical account is littered with bodies. In the Hebrew Bible, it's the chosen people, the Jews, who are able to do what is necessary in order to safeguard themselves. There are stories in the Hebrew Bible in which God demands the submission of other populations, the wiping out of other populations.
From the Bible, we learn that there are clear distinctions between people. There are righteous and the so-called unrighteous. There are Jews and so-called Gentiles. The Bible is the source that teaches us that there is a hierarchy amongst humans, with a God who sides with certain people he deems as his people. Chosen thee to be a special people. The Lord loved Israel, chosen Jacob unto himself. God went to redeem for a people to himself, separate them from among all the people. And I have chosen the seed of Abraham, are just a few examples.
And I've always argued that the only way you can be a chosen person is not by some God making you a chosen person. The only way you can be a chosen person is to be a self-choosing person. And when Africans are self-choosing, they become chosen people. It's only when you are not self-choosing that you, in a sense, are outside of your own history.
But that's what the Old Testament does. It says, my tribe, I've been given the right by my God to dominate your tribe. Well, in current culture and in many other cultures, That notion that my tribe is blessed by God allows me to do things to other people who are not like me in the name of my God. And that's all racism is in many cases. The permission, a God-given permission by one group to dominate, oppress, and rule another group.
I think we all read the Bible from our own social, political, economic, cultural location. And so the Bible reads differently depending on who's reading it. So the Bible is a tool. It really could be used any way you want to use it. I mean, I've seen people use wrenches as hammers.
In monotheistic belief systems, there has to be an adversary. In fact, the concept of a devil is exclusive to monotheism. Blacks, perceived as the antithesis of whites, were considered heathens, essentially devils, whose very purpose was to be enslaved. The Bible was used to rationalize slavery, and it even provided instructions on how to treat slaves. This put meat to the bones of American enslavement and justified an institution of chattel slavery that lasted nearly 4 centuries.
Now, none of these books were written by God, because there's no such thing. So they're not written by God. They're written by human beings who then claim that God wrote them. You see? They're written by human beings who say, this is the word of God.
Virginia lawmakers and presidents took the Bible's view of slavery literally, as it served to confirm their view of blacks and their reasons for being. In 1667, the Virginia legislature wrote into law the principle that God himself rendered the slaves inferior because God was on the side of the master.
White supremacy in itself as a notion depends upon the idea that the white race is supreme by virtue of God's own blessing.
And whiteness is a concept. I mean, it's that, it has changed. I mean, there was a time when Italians were not white, when Jews were not white, when Irish were not white. So when whiteness becomes the concept that can be dispensed like that, then of course, if you have that whiteness, you can certainly have privilege in a racist society. All racist societies are constructed along hierarchical lines.
In order to arrive at presumptions regarding superiority and inferiority as it relates to human beings, one must first have the backings or blessings of something. Notions of superiority must be endorsed by something feared, trusted, respected, and perceived as greater than human. The validation, endorsement, and approval of white supremacy came directly from a God fantasy.
The brain gave us something that it needed to explain what we did not know, what was hidden. Where does lightning come from? Why do people die? How is birth possible? The brain even gives itself its name. The brain is quite tricky in these things, you see. So the creation of God is a human creation.
The belief in a God who made the colonists exclusively in his image solidified and guaranteed perceptions of divine value and worth.
Remember that you are an Englishman and have consequentially won first prize in the lottery of life.
South African businessman Cecil Rhodes. Like gold and silver once gave the dollar its value and was redeemable by law, the founders of America believed that white supremacy was backed and given value by the God in their fantasies, and that they would be redeemed on Judgment Day for the institution of slavery, since it followed the natural order of their God's purpose for humanity.
In all social systems, there must be a class to do the menial duties, to perform the drudgery of life. That is, a class requiring but a low order of intellect and but little skill. Fortunately for the South, she has found a race adapted to that purpose at her hand, a race inferior to her own, but eminently qualified in temper, in vigor, in docility, in capacity to stand the climate, to answer all her purposes. We use them for our purpose, and we call them slaves.
James Henry Hammond, South Carolina Senator.
How is it that a white population has been able to bear the weight of such violent disregard of other folks? Right? How do they sleep at night in light of the violent approach towards black, brown, and other so-called racial minorities? It seems to me that this takes place in a variety of ways. One, they assume that these other populations are not fully human in the way that whites are human. They are not entitled to what whites are entitled to.
When one believes in a supreme being, it's a seamless transition to believe in supreme human beings. But blacks were considered less than human, and blackness was believed to be a sin in Virginia. Therefore, blacks were encouraged to believe that their blackness was a sin in the eyes of a God who was perceived and depicted as white. The goal of the slave codes, which were a series of statutes that became law, were to make blacks feel so hopeless and powerless about being black that they would more easily submit to lifelong servitude.
When you back a group's collective bias with legal authority and institutional control, it's transformed into a far-reaching system that is not dependent on any individual's good intentions, self-image, or friendliness.
The most efficient way to accomplish such a demoralizing mindset was through Christianity. The enslaved blacks had to come to grips with the notion that it was God himself that made them inferior, and therefore it was to be accepted as just an act of nature. After all, according to the Virginia legislature and all the colonies that followed its leadership, this was God's will, and anyone opposed to this natural order would have to take it up with the big man upstairs. And essentially, that's how gods have been depicted throughout history, as big, exaggerated versions of ourselves that we assign various superhuman traits and attributes that serve our emotional needs and help us reconcile our fears.
And so I think it's really ultimately about power. Whose ideas, whose culture, whose history, whose spirituality, whose notions of deity reign supreme and therefore are normal, and as opposed to or as compared to others. So ultimately, I think it's about power.
Beginning in 1705 until 1865, the slave codes determined the treatment of blacks in a way that no other period had. Things changed dramatically. In 1705, the Virginia General Assembly permanently sealed the fate of blacks.
All servants imported and brought into the country who were not Christians in their native country shall be accounted and be slaves. All Negro, mulatto, and Indian slaves within this dominion shall be held to be real estate. If any slave resist his master, correcting such slave, and shall happen to be killed in such correction, the master shall be free of all punishment, as if such accident never happened.
This just in from St. Louis. A judge there has found a former police officer not guilty of first-degree murder in the 2011 shooting death of a black motorist.
The U.S. Department of Justice will not bring charges against Baltimore police officers in connection with the death of...
He shot into a car with no regard to human life.
and that's okay.
That insufficient evidence exists to charge either officer with a federal crime.
After the grand jury in Staten Island chose not to indict a police officer in the chokehold.
This 1705 Virginia law, another law that was followed by the rest of the colonies, was a Category 5 hurricane that flooded the mentalities of the nation with the idea that blacks are indeed less in kind, in a legal sense, and in the eyes of their God. Again, the first step in so-called civilizing enslaved blacks was to force them to accept Christianity. Given the times when believing in gods were the norm, it's reasonable to assume that many blacks actually believed that the master's God was indeed a superior God, since it was clear that they were the ones enslaved. The master made certain that there was little distinction between serving his God and serving him. It was necessary for the slave master that the enslaved blacks perceived he and God as one and the same. Virginia legislatures did their best to clear all doubts of greater and lesser as far as humans were concerned. For nearly 2 centuries, there was no real distinction between sheep, horses, cattle, and blacks. According to the convictions and opinions of Virginia lawmakers, their God created he and his kind exclusively in his image. The law essentially assigned value and worth to people. Early and classic images of religious figures became the wind beneath the wings of white supremacy and racial hierarchy. One of the many things that separate humans from other species is our imagination and our ability to act, make laws, and treat others based upon those things we've imagined. When one imagines a supreme being, one will naturally begin putting a face and features to this being. The group in power will put the face and features of themselves and make these features official truth. In the eyes of blacks, however, it is impossible to measure the psychological impact of perceiving a God or the son of this God looking like the one who not only owns you, but is abusing you as well.
That says something right there about the psychology. And it says something about the security that gives the dominant culture. We not only can dominate you, we not only are the dominant religion here, but we've got your brains too.
You have no mind of your own. If you show me the God you worship, you show me the iconography of the God you worship, I will show you your conqueror. You cannot, or if not your conqueror, I will show you your victimage.
During times where imagery was the television of the day, there was a thin line between what one saw and what one believed. Images helped the enslaved blacks to accept their plight as slaves, to believe that this was the natural order of things. You have a God's favor, which is essentially the law of the land. You have the imagery of the times to corroborate white supremacy, and you have whites as the owners and blacks as the enslaved. When you have all of these factors and societal components in place, the question was not whether whites, irrespective of their status, believed they were superior to blacks. The question was, how could they not believe that?
White supremacy, it's a highly descriptive term for the everyday culture we're in, which relentlessly circulates messages that white is ideal, white is the norm for humanity, and everyone else is a deviation from that norm.
Why should we accept this belief in white superiority as a normal psychological way of thinking? And it has very little to do with any reality. I mean, I've never known a white person who was superior to me, and I always accept what my father had always taught me in Georgia. Nobody can be superior to you unless you act inferior.
Precepts of superiority don't just go away because time passes. Precepts stand the test of time when laws may change and amendments may be added. The ashes of hate have, over the course of so many generations, accumulated at the bottom of our memory. There they lie uneasily, like a heavy secret which whites can never quite confess, which blacks can never quite forgive, and which for both blacks and whites forestalls until a distant day any hope of peace and redemption. Perhaps even the most liberal of whites would claim they have absolutely no racist bones in their body, and they don't see color, and that God is a spirit and doesn't have a color, and they don't envision an image of a white God when they close their eyes and pray. But images of a white God are so ubiquitous and pervasive that it's virtually impossible not to envision these classic representations that we all grew up with and see on a daily basis.
It is impossible to live in the context of the United States, be white, and not be tainted by the workings of white supremacy and white privilege. And to be white and Christian simply involves a supreme justification for that privilege and that assumed superiority.
In court, for instance, a prosecutor may mention something about a defendant's past that is irrelevant to his current case. The defense attorney will object, and the judge will request the jury to disregard the prosecutor's remarks. The problem with this is that the train has already left the station. The jury cannot erase what they've heard. The mere mentioning of the defendant's past cannot be undone. The same is true of the images of which we've been exposed since birth and continue to be bombarded with 24 hours a day. There's this paradox that says we are all made in this God's image, yet we are not all equally represented when it comes to imagery depicting this God figure. If blacks and whites were two teams psychologically competing on American turf, whites would have the home field advantage.
And I live in a society that relentlessly shapes me every day in a way that advantages me and disadvantages you. And there's no way I couldn't have been impacted by that society. It's the default of it. And much of it I've internalized because at the conscious level, it conflicts with my self-identity to say that I have advantage over you. And so that makes me deny it, which only protects it.
Our brains are always attempting to put pieces together. If Jesus is perceived as white, then his father, / Jesus in the flesh, as some believe, would be also. All of this doesn't matter, of course, from a historical standpoint or from a standpoint of reality. What matters is perception.
If you oppress somebody, put them under a high enough amount of stress, they flip and they start seeing not the white masters as their masters, but as their saviors. And you start seeing them worshiping the white Jesus and the white iconography that comes out of mainly Protestant North America.
When you consistently subject non-whites, especially children, to white God figures and other white religious imagery, you are insidiously crippling them psychologically.
People say it doesn't matter what color Jesus is or what color whatever God they're worshiping is. I would strongly object to that. Children can be deeply affected by the dominant culture in such a way that they don't even recognize their own worth within that culture.
If it doesn't matter, then there ought to be variety. And in America, there certainly ought to be variety. If it doesn't matter, then why do we have all these black churches with white Jesuses?
Some may see this imagery as normal, but others see it as insulting and as a form of implied racism because it has no basis in reality. There's politics behind it, and there were once laws put in place to support this kind of imagery. The general rules of the 17th and 18th century are still inconspicuously teaching us how and what to think about one another, and imagery teaches us without saying a word. Throughout the centuries, the universal image of God in Jesus has remained white.
Part of the lie that the Christian church continues to tell people, particularly in America, is that God is white, the holy angels are white, the council of elders are white, Jesus is white, the Holy Ghost is white, heaven is white, purity is white. And so the whole cosmic sky, if you will, is white. So we associate right, white, and God.
Images of God and Mary and the apostles and the saints as white is a really powerful implicit message, because I'm not thinking about it at all. We're not even going to have a debate. Right? We might have a debate about whether Confederate monuments are racist, but the fact that we're not talking about how fundamentally racist it is to render Jesus Christ white, to render an image of God as white, we're not even going to talk about that. And so it's more powerful because it's more insidious and it's more protected.
And to give us even figures out of those churches that are supposed to be the only spiritual ones, the great spiritual fathers, and a few mothers, but mostly fathers. That's very dangerous.
Black artists have attempted to reverse the psychology by depicting Jesus as black, which many blacks arguably believe is the historically accurate image. To other blacks, however, images of a black Jesus is even more insulting. Claiming a black Jesus as the savior is inconsistent with black people being on the bottom rungs in so many areas of society. But using various strategies to deal with racism in America are psychological defense mechanisms that are often necessary. We've all seen that classic children's Bible placed in the waiting rooms of doctors' offices. You'll find characters that are depicted as the first humans on Earth, characters responsible for saving the animals, parting the waters, saving humanity, and doing all the magical and miraculous things that have allegedly led us to where we are now. All of this is stored in a child's subconscious. You don't have to tell people they're superior. It's inferred through an unlimited supply of imagery. Imagery is the subtle side of racism.
I think the image always speaks louder than the words. That's why iconography is so important. The symbol always speaks louder. It points beyond itself to a deeper reality. And though we are not conscious of the processes that are taking place inside of us, very often they have a much more and deeper and longer lasting impact.
Based upon the precepts and laws, along with the reinforcing imagery throughout history, it's only natural for many whites to see themselves as the prototype human being and all others as experiments that somehow miss the mark of perfection. It's the story of America. It's the beliefs that have been passed down from generation to generation.
Well, I think white, the dominant culture in North America, benefits from religious imagery that's predominantly white because it creates a sense that we are the controlling race. We are the controlling tribe of North America in this case.
Whites who were resistant to change during the Civil Rights era were born, bred, and raised on classic religious images. These images were in their homes and stained into their church windows. They saw these images in all the stories they were ever taught or ever read about Christianity. How many of those men and women who were opposed to justice and equal treatment under the law for blacks during that era entered into politics or have sons or daughters who are now in decision-making positions? How have their perceptions changed? Have they changed at all? The injustice towards blacks during the Civil Rights period had its roots in a time that believed blacks were subhuman and somehow deserved such treatment. To them, they were just adhering to what they believed as being the natural order of things. America went through great measures to assure that blacks stayed in their place. That so-called place was the one assigned to them by the God in their fantasies.
Your race is adapted to be a race of farmers, first, last, and for all times.
William Howard Taft, 27th President of the United States. The notion of white supremacy was not only at the root of white resistance, but it was the foundation upon which America was built. The belief that blacks were of less value, ironically, proved to be very valuable in creating wealth for America. Civil rights lawyer Thurgood Marshall, during the Supreme Court arguments regarding the case of Brown versus Board of Education and blacks in segregated public schools, stated,
"The only way that the Supreme Court could uphold this unfair law was to prove that blacks were inferior to whites."
The research shows that by age 3 to 4, all children who grow up in this country understand it's better to be white.
It's unreasonable to expect people who grew up watching classic religious films like The Ten Commandments,
Behold his mighty hand,
the greatest story ever told,
I am the resurrection,
King of Kings, etc., to be totally free from subjective bias. Even today, movies like The Passion of the Christ, The Son of God, and Heaven is for Real, etc., are believed to be innocent family films for most, but are racially insensitive to those who see it as just another form of implicit racism.
Not only do those movies reinforce it for white people, they reinforce it for black people. So black people watch the same movies, and they come away, their takeaway is the same. And that's what is damaging. That's why I say it has destroyed black people.
Who is he? How do men call him? Why, he's called Jesus, the son of Joseph, the Galilean. So.
Since the beginning of film, America has implied that only one race has relationships with that which is perceived as divine. Sadly, there are many blacks who support these movies, perhaps because they are either blind or indifferent to the psychological implications of such films that send clear signals pertaining to superiority and inferiority. We are the products of a mindset that believed in a God that did not and still does not feel the same way about the blacks as he does about the whites. Because if he did, blacks would have similar privileges as whites. They wouldn't have been slaves in the first place. they wouldn't have been the ones marching, praying, and fighting for their freedom.
Why do people of African descent suffer in a way that is disproportional? When they're Christian, they tend to want to understand themselves as being in line with God's chosen people, the Jews of the Hebrew Bible, the Christians of the New Testament. But here's the issue. If you look at the history of people of African descent in the context of the United States, it's just as reasonable to assume if there is a God, we are, from the vantage point of that God, the Moabites, the Hittites, the Canaanites, the ones who get wiped out, not the ones who are privileged.
Many have tried to justify the notion of black inferiority based strictly upon empirical evidence. An inability to problem solve often comes into question.
Embedded in black Christianity from its very beginning has been an underlying assumption that suffering is redemptive. And to be Christ-like then, to follow the model of that God human, entails this sort of understanding of suffering. That this suffering produces something that is great. In church circles, it's not unusual for folks to say, no cross, no crown. We're tried like fire, but will come out as pure gold. Again, the idea being that their suffering will somehow benefit them. Now, I'm not quite certain how a population, on one hand, says that white supremacy is a problem and has to be dismantled, that it is doing harm to black people, and yet on the other hand says our suffering is redemptive. How do you hold accountable a population that is imposing misery when you are, in fact, saying misery is redemptive? It sends a mixed message.
It would be negligent to claim that blacks do not bear some of the brunt of their current predicament. But what many fail to realize is that slavery was like an earthquake, and blacks are still feeling the tremors and aftershocks. It's not a matter of inferiority so much as it is a matter of historical circumstances. Many whites in America have acquired wealth and privilege through inheritance. But blacks, on the other hand, as a collective, were never in positions to inherit or benefit from generational wealth. Many of the largest and prestigious universities and highly profitable corporations in America got their start either directly or indirectly from the institution of slavery. Discriminatory tactics such as redlining, profiling, and bank fraud have greatly contributed to the state of Black America. Claims of inferiority as so-called proof of this state implies there is nothing that can be done, and that blacks by themselves are helplessly incapable of correcting their own issues. Again, what's missing here is the role history has played in shaping people's circumstances, thoughts, and behavior. Because blacks were denied opportunities to be autonomous, they were forced to rely on prayer as a coping mechanism, as well as using prayer as a first line of defense in resolving issues. We see that same phenomenon today, where blacks spend disproportionate amounts of time in church but are still experiencing major problems.
And African people, African American people particularly, we are quite energetic in our attachment to this religion, which was, in a sense, forced upon us by those who hated us in the first place and enslaved us, our ancestors. And then they turned around and gave us this, and we accepted it and bought it.
I think in a psychological sense, people want something they can lean on psychologically. And a lot of that goes back probably to early childhood. We had parents who were godlike when we were children, and I think we long for that kind of care and safety and concern when we're older.
Humans are self-aware. We recognize that our days are numbered, our life is limited. And that produces a certain type of anxiety, a certain type of concern for us. For many, they resolve this dilemma, they wrestle with this anxiety by positing a life beyond this material world shaped by human history. They understand that the end of this life is not the end of their meaning, not the end of their being.
But religious framework is a framework. You weren't born interpreting through a religious framework. You were conditioned into doing it. Now it becomes so natural, and part of the conditioning is to be told it's God's will, but you were taught it. There is no human objectivity.
Historically, blacks have been conditioned to seek answers from supernatural sources and to see faith and prayer as viable and pragmatic solutions for bringing about change. But black issues must also be resolved through human effort, human sacrifice, human intelligence, and human dollars. We must also keep in mind that it was customary during the American enslavement period to grant certain rights and privileges to blacks who went all out to show public displays of loyalty to Christianity. Black devotion to Christianity could have meant the difference between life and death. Therefore, it's no accident that blacks are still unyieldingly devoted to their Christian faith, the religion that potentially saved their ancestors' lives and spared them several lashes on the plantation. Many whites would take offense to claims of being superior, and understandably so. But when there are reinforcing images all around, there will be notions of superiority.
Every religion on this planet creates gods that look a whole lot like the people that are creating the gods. So if you've got a god from your area, that god probably looks like you.
So white people need to see white God. That's cool. Where it becomes problematic for me is when they say, I have to see God the way they do. White people want to see white angels. That's cool for white people. All right? It's problematic when you insist that that is the truth instead of a truth born out of your own imagination and experience.
There is also the tendency to conflate dominance and privilege with superiority. There are countless of well-meaning people with good intentions who believe that there's a God who sees all of his children as equal. We've all heard it. Everyone is equal in the eyes of God. It's easy to make this claim, but the real issue is whether we really perceive one another as equal. That's all that really matters. Our perceptions on earth where we live and work together. Religious books, billboards, monuments, and imagery in public places helps perpetuate notions of superiority and inferiority while maintaining the illusion of the separation of church and state.
Government shouldn't harm religious gathering. Folks are free to do in their private lives what they want to do with respect to religion. But government should not be privileging religion. So all of these religious organizations that are talking about wanting to help out in communities, here's a good way to do it. Pay your property taxes. That's money that would go into local economies and would get more done than a soup kitchen or a clothing giveaway.
Yeah, see, this is where I come to. I don't want to get into censorship. You know, I think people ought to be able to publish what they want to publish. They ought to be able to place it where they want to place it. I think parents and elders, uncles and aunties have a responsibility to teach their children.
I think we'd be light years ahead if we could legislate things like you can't have images of God or Jesus or children's books that aren't historically accurate, right? Like I'm not remotely confident that that would happen, but is it worth thinking about? Do I wish white people had a consciousness about that? Do I wish that when they opened a book and for children and saw white images of Jesus and Mary and they would recognize, oh, that's an outdated book, that's an inappropriate book.
The men that planted the seeds, cultivated the precepts, and are responsible for our attitudes about race are gone forever. But the vestiges of what they left behind still remain.
You're living in poverty, your schools are no good, you have no jobs, 58% of your youth is unemployed. What the hell do you have to lose?
Racial conflicts are combustible and have the potential to tear this country further apart unless we learn its origins and change old habits rooted in ignorance, antiquated beliefs, and superstitions.
When it comes to white supremacists, they are the #1 domestic terrorism threat in America. This is coming from the Homeland Security.
When you live your entire life immersed in white history and believing that no other group is relevant to your individual or intellectual growth or of any benefit to the story and evolution of America, there will always be racial conflict in America.
So parents have to awaken their children, if you will, to this kind of ongoing, continuous, dogmatic assault against black life, brown life, Native American life, I don't care. Any life that is not white and male.
When you live in a culture that relentlessly reflects you, where virtually every teacher you've ever had, every role model, God himself is white, then any even posture that you have that shows your dignity and inherent worth as a black person is going to unsettle me.
We have to understand the origins and evolution of racism in order to fight it more effectively. It started with presumptions of a God and traveled to beliefs, and then on to contradictions, and on to precepts, then to the legal system, and finally it became an institution, all of which have their roots planted within the mindsets of the 17th and 18th century. There's no magic wand that's going to solve racism, but one thing is for certain. You don't practice racism towards people you feel are equal to you.
I have a strong feeling of repugnance when I think of the Negro being made our political equal, and I would be glad if they could be colonized, sent to heaven, or got rid of in any decent way.
James Garfield, 20th President of the United States. We have to abandon the hierarchy complex that only exists in our minds. Hierarchical systems based on the belief that a God created some to rule and others to serve is highly delusional.
We're not going to change America. That's just not going to happen. What we can change, what we have the power to change, is ourselves.
Religion is not going away. It offers humans a way of justifying their tendency to produce insider and outsider groups. I'm also not hopeful that race is going away. That what we can do is work to manage it and to make certain that we decrease the kind of harm that difference does.
You can't have a discussion about racism without discussing the notion of white supremacy. And you can't discuss white supremacy without discussing the belief in a supreme being and the role the Bible has played. It's okay to fantasize about supreme beings, but what's not okay is to impose those fantasies upon all of society. That's how we end the hierarchy complex.
My eyes took me a second, but I realized that I'm still the same man I was yesterday. See, I made a promise to myself to make a change and better myself, but I don't feel any difference, and that's a shame. All I want is to be a better man. The slate again, but I know the change. No, it don't come easy. Change. No, it don't come easy to me. Change. Change. All I want is change. No, it don't come easy to me. My family and friends, you all know how it is. They got your back and they just won't fall away. But this is something I've gotta do for myself. I'm thankful, but I can't take that help. Gotta do this my way, my way, my way.